particularly in light of what we're talking about here, are also concerned with the lower levels, the ones that don't cause immediate death, that don't cause radiation sickness, but low-level radiation has been progressively implicated in genetic diseases and other chronic diseases, and it's something that we have to look at as well beyond cancer in terms of what the impact of the Japanese people and others from Fukushima. Many studies have been conducted by the National Academy of Sciences over the years have come up with the various volumes of the biological effects of ionizing radiation, or BEIR. The latest, a few years ago, volume 7, substantiates what is the central thesis and understanding of scientists, that there's a linear no-threshold hypothesis. In other words, there is no safe level of radiation. If you have small amount of radiation, it doesn't mean that you as an individual are going to necessarily die, develop cancer, or anything like that. But these are looked at over the population. So if you have 100,000 people, you're going to have maybe an extra 1,000 of those 100,000 who will develop cancer. Maybe 50% of them will die. So those are the issues that we're dealing with. So many of the current and past attempts of the nuclear power industry is to discount that, say that's so low, you don't have to be worried about it. But again, if we're looking at populations overall, this has a significant impact on them. And just so you know a little bit more about my background, I've worked for over 30 years as a pathologist, which is diagnosing cancer, understanding what causes cancer. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today is based on that experience, including discussing some of the particular types of cancers and risks that have already been discussed earlier today. We know that this understanding of the no safe dose of radiation has evolved to the point where you could see the significant changes in what are health protective standards for nuclear workers. Like all workers, they're like the canaries in the uranium mine in terms of the more significant effects that they get or are allowed to receive as nuclear workers compared with the population at large. But even these low levels, as we can see from a recent article, which you can't read from where you are, and I want to thank Steve again for sending us out on the listserv. There's a recent very important article in The Lancet, the prominent British medical journal, that for the first time had enough population data to really have some statistically significant analysis of what the dangers were, and have now implicated what have previously been regarded as low-level radiation in increased numbers of leukemias, lymphomas. There are certain types of tumors of what produces blood cells and the lymphoid cells that are involved with our immune system. So this is one of the first studies that has the statistical power to actually make the connection and actually hopefully will lead to even reduced exposures among those who work with various radiological materials. It's just not just workers in nuclear power plants like Bob and others who we have to think about. It's the loads of people who work in the medical field, who are around radiology technicians, etc., who are exposed over the course, and there's a number of people involved in the studies who've been involved with that type of exposure. And again, when we're talking about the impacts on worker health, we have to put that within the context of the whole nuclear fuel chain, because we have to look at the life cycle analysis. So for example, when people say, no problem having a nuclear power plant because that's the solution to climate change, because the nuclear fuel doesn't produce a lot of, or an operating nuclear power plant doesn't produce a lot of carbon dioxide. Well, they're not talking about how much fossil fuel is involved with making the nuclear fuel, so you have to have a full accounting of that. But we have to look not only about the operating nuclear power plants, but the whole life cycle. The Navajo and other miners who mine uranium, or in Australia, or in Africa. The processing and enrichment, what do we do with the waste, not only health effects on workers, neighbors, and community health effects. That's something that it's at the heart of PSR's work, but I won't be talking about it today. The significant proliferation issues in terms of the diversion of nuclear power to fueling the various weapons programs around the world, and whether that be Pakistan transferring to a possible Iranian nuclear program, the connections with the Korean programs, et cetera, in terms of that type of breakout. We know from our history